Hi everyone. I'm going to present the MetaSounds Menagerie. So I'm Stefan. I'm a solution architect for Epic Games, and I'm also director of real-time of Mondex Studios, which is a studio in Germany. I'm actually a 3D artist, so I specialize in everything that's materials related, lighting, production, and so on. So you're wondering why am I here? Well, I've always made music on the side all my life. I've had a pretty terrible trance music phase when I was a teenager, but it allowed me to kind of learn how to create, synthesizer sounds. And I had the same Skrillex phase where I kind of wanted to learn how to create absolutely mental sounds, which was made from scratch with synths. So to put this into context, when I discovered that Metasound existed within Unreal Engine, I was so shocked that there was actually an audio system in the tool that I'm using every day. So it kind of allowed me to blend both worlds because I could blend my visual skills and my audio skills in one single package. And since you can kind of make things interact, I created a bunch of different, very, very simple personal projects. So what I'm going to show here is I'm going to show a couple of examples that I made. These are personal projects that took me maybe 1 or 2 days. I like to mess around and then pass the project onto something else. And then I'm going to create a simple procedural loop live. So I apologize in advance if it's really terrible. I'm going to try and make something good, but I'm going to improvise a bit, so hopefully it'll be interesting for you guys. And then if we have time, some Q&A. So let me just show you a couple of my projects that I've made, which doesn't seem to work. There we go. All right, thanks to the Dolby guys, this is sounding really good. Nice. So let's get going. I'll try and skip some things that I don't deem very important, because otherwise we'll be here for a whole day. The whole point of this is to make something very quickly. So let's create a MetaSounds source. Let's call it a game sound card. Perfect. So let's get going. Now we don't need this. This is just in case we're doing a one-shot. Again, I'm going to gloss over a lot here, so sorry if it's a bit complicated at first, but hopefully you'll see where I'm going with this. So you have different selections here. That would be cool to do in 7.1, but again, we'd be here for the whole day, so let's do stereo. And then you'll notice that there's a bunch of things that most audio people are familiar with. So for instance, we have a stereo mixer. I took the 8 input because I filled these up quite quickly. You'll figure it out also that it's probably better to start right away with this one. And you have a bunch of tools that you can use. So the first one I'm going to use is the wave player. So the wave player is just a standard wave player, and you can see that you have different kind of outputs here. Again, we're going to take a stereo, and then we're going to plug the audio outputs. And feel free to check these out in the documentation. Again, I'm just going to skip these because in our case, it's not super important. So I used a couple of very basic drum machine samples here. So let's take the kick, for instance. And the gain, this is quite important. So I'm going to explain to you guys the differences between an input and a variable. The inputs are probably my favorite thing in Metasounds because you can control them outside of Metasounds. You can control them inside, of course, but these can be controlled with blueprints in-game. So you can actually make things very dynamic, and you'll see that it's not just volume. You can actually change many things within the game. So let's just call this, let's call this kick. Perfect. And then when you connect on play here, there we go. So we're not really ready to win a Grammy just yet. We actually need to add a bunch of things. So we have different ways to kind of interact with the audio using triggers, which is what you're seeing right here. So on play, you press play. Okay, good, very simple. We have a bunch of different things you can do, especially trigger repeats. Let me just find it. Let me repeat, that's better. So you can, when this plays, you can decide what period you want between each trigger, and then it's just going to trigger this kick many times. There you go. Now that's a bit too speedy for our taste. So let's select BPM to seconds. This is also one of my favorite things because people like me who aren't like super technical with timings or maybe knowledge of music creation, I wouldn't know what the period of 90 BPM is. So thankfully we have this node here. Let's keep 90 BPM just to keep things a bit simple. 4 divisions, and then there. Now we have a 90 BPM kick. So we're already getting somewhere. Let's duplicate this, and then let's add a snare. Now, obviously, the snare itself, we're going to have a different timing. Otherwise, it's going to sound pretty bad. But again, same things. You don't have to put inputs. You can keep things within the Metasound itself. But I recommend to use as much input as possible because later on you can change them in real time. So you could mute some instruments. You can change some effects in-game. So you could create an entire procedural track and have it depend on, let's say, a character you create. Maybe you have a character that's a bit more aggressive, so maybe you have more distortion. You can go really, really far with this. But in our case, let's not get too ahead of ourselves. So you have a Azerty at home. There we go. Now, we're going to see how variables work. So instead of just duplicating this 50,000 times, we're actually going to find a way to have our own kind of little timer thing. So we're just going to duplicate this 4 times. This is my method of working, so I really apologize if it's not the most efficient, but this is just how I like to produce things. And again, BPM, we know that we would like to change the BPM later on. So let's create a BPM input. It's very cool that you have nodes being created in this system, but obviously now it's at maximum 1 BPM, which isn't great. So in here, you actually have different solutions. You can have a slider. In our case, let's just keep it a value, and then we'll change it later on if you want. So we do this here. Now this is a bit of the boring part, so it's not super exciting, but you'll see that it can be quite useful later on. And then we're going to create a variable. The difference between input and variable is that the variable is just going to read a value that you can use later on. So it's really just for efficiency. Sorry. So what we're going to do is, let's take a 16th subdivision, 8th subdivision. So this is just to have different speeds later on. That's easy to control. 2. And then let's create some variables again and again. There we go. Now, I recommend you name things properly, but in my case, I'm going to be very lazy and just literally write the subdivision. When you have a massive Metasound graph later on, you're going to hate yourself if you do what I'm doing here, but you know, this is a quick demo, so I think we're going to be fine. All right, so now we can go back to our kick, and we know right away that it's a 4th subdivision. So we have all the variables we created just now. There we go. And so now you can see that we can just redo this, but we can decide the timing pretty easily. Let me just find this. So our snare, we're going to have probably half-time snare, so we actually want a slower subdivision than 8. But you'll probably guess that if I press play now, let me just reduce the volume with the kick and the snare, it's going to play on the first hit, which isn't exactly what we want. And I just noticed we used the 4. I'm sorry, I'm supposed to use the 2, probably better. Yeah. So we have the good timing, but it starts, very, very simple rhythm. So that's where we have many different options to do this. We have the trigger delay, which I love. And now you can understand why I created these variables before, because otherwise you're going to have to be doing this all the time. Here you can kind of guess, okay, I want my snare to start on the second hit. So we want a delay of 4, which is the same subdivision as the kick. If it sounds complicated, it's probably normal because some people like me don't really have a lot of musical knowledge, but once you try it out, you kind of get into the groove of it. So there we go. Okay, so getting a bit better, not perfect, but at least we're getting a nice rhythm. Now let's add a closed hat, let's say, and I'm probably going to do a 16th subdivision. Yeah, plugging things isn't the most exciting thing, I'm sorry. We'll get somewhere. There we go, and this can be called hats. And you guessed it, we'll just do, actually, let's just copy and paste this. You'll see that my graphs are usually quite messy, so again, ignore all the organization thing, but this is just, I like to work quite quickly and then iterate on it, so yeah. 16th, there we go. Okay, now we're getting a bit somewhere. Not great. Something that we can do is to add a certain groove is to sidechain. I think a lot of you know what sidechain is, but just in case you don't, is when a sound kind of subtracts the volume to another sound, so the sound ducks and then goes back up when the sound is being played. There's different ways to do this because you actually have a compressor with a built-in sidechain system. Now, I don't know why, I like to create a variable of, I took the left channel out of random, but I took a variable for the kick channel, because this means that every time the kick is being played, this is actually going to have some information in it. And actually, just to make things easier, I'm going to use an envelope follower. So what this does is that when there's a volume being played, you actually have audio going out, but you also have this green thing, which is float. So this is a number. So it means that when the kick is being played, it's going to output a number. So let's multiply. Yeah, we can do math with audio, which can get quite stressful and quite tricky at first, but don't worry, it's pretty fine. I'm going to clamp it. Actually, never mind. I'm going to create a variable here. So this I'm going to call sidechain. Probably with again, sorry. And then this, we're going to put an input, not a variable, because I would like to control the amount of sidechains. So you can kind of imagine here that we're taking a value from the kick. Maybe you want the kick to be a bit more powerful. So in here, we can call it sidechain amount. Nice. So what we can actually do here, we can actually subtract audio with floats. So you can actually, which is kind of mental, but you can subtract audio with audio, you can subtract audio with floats. And so you could create, for instance, you could create like a float, audio to float, which is also insane because you have an audio output that's being automatically converted into numbers. So I wasn't being very, very precise here, but you can go anywhere you want. Oops, sorry about this. So let me have a think. So how am I going to subtract this value with this value? But actually, I'm going to be even lazier, is I'm just going to subtract the gain of the hats with the sidechain value that we just created here. So let's find it on the left. The sidechain amount, there we go, sidechain, it was in variables. Once I'll press play, it's going to make a bit more sense. So there we go. And then now we have sidechain amount, which is here. Let's put it a bit higher up. And we're not hearing anything, so I think I'm doing something wrong. I apologize. Let me just check. Right, also we have to clamp things here because you can actually have the gain be inverse underneath 0, so that can be kind of risky. So I'm going to do something called a clamp, which just allows you to make sure that the output gain doesn't go too far up. So we're subtracting our hat gain by the sidechain here, which is being multiplied by the sidechain amount. Maybe I need a bit more. There we go. I think I just needed higher values. So now you can see that you kind of have to figure out how you want to do it yourself, but at least now we have a little bit of a groove happening. So this is the very, very big basics of how to create a simple rhythm. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to use a preset that I made. Because you can create a meta sound like here, and you can actually put this meta sound inside another meta sound. So you can call this one drum machine or whatever, and then duplicate it 50 times if you want, and have a completely insane polyrhythmic experience, if that's what we want to do. But in our case, let's stay simple. So I made something called a basic synth, which is what it is. So we have a saw oscillator and a sine oscillator, and then you have a frequency. Now, thank God we have this tool here, which is MIDI to frequency, because otherwise there's a lot of math that has to be done. So you're just inputting numbers here that are being converted, so this saw wave is playing the frequency that you want. I did a bunch of inputs, as you can see here, the transpose, the octave, the MIDI in, and you'll see that these are accessible later on when we're going to add them to our meta sound. And then for the sine wave, all I did is that I took it an octave down and playing it at the same time. Then I multiply it by, you can multiply audio by float. Again, it's so crazy, but it does work. You can add then more sub to your sound. This sound is actually being played constantly. So what you have to do is to use a envelope. So some of you that are using synthesizers are going to be like, this is super basic. But again, just to show that you can start with this and then you can like add more and more as you work. Added a low filter, why not? Some stereo delay, and then in the stereo output. So what's cool is that you can see it here, basic synth, and you can see all the inputs I created are here and accessible. So let's do the same thing as before, and I warned you that this can get quite messy, but again, I find it so fun, I'm fine with it. Let's create an input, let's call this bass, with capital letters because it's more badass. And same thing as before, actually I'm just gonna copy and paste this. Yeah, it doesn't like it when you copy paste variables too much, so let me just put this again. Going to take our bass, subtract the sidechain amount, clamp to make sure we don't go over 1 or under 0, put it back here. Now, I created an envelope, as I showed you before, to open the sound and close it. So let's make a short attack. Again, I named these. You can name them as you want, but obviously just for sanity's sake, I took the same wordings as you'd find on a regular synthesizer. So this will create a very, very short sound. And let's take this again. Now for the bass, let's make a very, very fast short bass. There we go here. Now when I press play, there you go. So already, as you can see, it's being sidechained the same amount as the hi-hat, so you could create different systems like one sidechain for the hi-hat, one sidechain for the bass. But again, we'll be here for quite a long time if I do this, so let me just show you the most interesting part that I feel is in Metasound, is that these guys are crazy and actually created an array, so a list of MIDI values for each different scale, and you have some pretty crazy scales in here. All right, so let's take, let's take lead in for some, maybe lead in again? Okay, let's go crazy. It might sound bad, but let's see. So you have something here that's called random get, which is what I'm using a lot. What that means is that every time this is going to be triggered, it's going to take a random value from this, and then it's going to inject it in our basic synth. Now this basic synth preset is going to be accessible to everyone for free, so if you want to play around with it and maybe make it a bit more complicated, feel free. I now have to raise it an octave because the values here aren't the same. And then we're going to reuse, again, the same system as before. But now you can decide how often do you want the bass note to change. You can kind of have a think, maybe, yeah, let's have every 2 just to hear what it's going to do. Let's press play. So already you're getting random notes. What's interesting is that if I just press play and leave it going, it's going to just change notes randomly for the whole thing. So, the base of music is at least some repetition at least. So let me just remove the stereo delay, because you don't really need it now. We're going to use, again, another thing called a trigger counter. There you go. So what this is going to do is it's going to count how many times has this been triggered. And then you can see you have a reset thing here, which is really awesome. Because what it's going to do is it's going to just pick the same random numbers, but in a loop. So the random numbers will actually become a repetition. So we actually want a repetition here, so let me just put 0 here. And the reset count is how many times will it change notes. So let me put 2, let's press play. There we go. So it doesn't sound very good, but you can kind of see where I'm going with this. So let's take 4, for instance. Something I noticed very later on is that by default, the seed number, which is just going to create the random value in which it's going to pick notes, every time you're going to press play is going to be a different one. And sometimes I'd be working on a very complex procedural track, and then I'd be super happy with one result, but I have 0 way of getting it back, which is why we have a seed system here that you can create an input out of. That means that if I write, I don't know, 4, 5, 6, whatever, and press play, and there you go. And you can kind of inject this number outside with blueprints. So you can find a way to store that value and create like your favorites. So obviously with a bit more work with this, you can get there. So I don't know, let's put 333. It sounds good, but I feel like we can maybe we have time to make things a bit more interesting. So let me just do exactly the same thing as before. I'm just going to copy the bass sound just to make it a bit more interesting, and I'm going to actually use the same inputs. And the reason I added transpose here is for some reason, sometimes I like to have maybe a 7th added to the MIDI notes, so you can just kind of repeat the same thing here. And then exactly the same here. Maybe this can be a bit longer. So you can really see the advantage of creating a preset. So I could have created a preset out of this to make things a bit easier. So instead of having this thing every time, you could just have like one output. Because if you can imagine that each time I would create a bass sound, I would have to redo this entirety. It would get really, really messy. So presets very, very important. And I think that if I press play, actually let me raise it 1 octave. There we go. That actually sounds like a 21 Pilots song, no? Maybe I don't know, I don't think they use that. But yeah, so you can kind of stack things on top of each other, and you can start to just duplicate this. I'm not saying that this is the best synth preset, but I've been using it for quite a while, and I think it's simple enough for people to get into it, but it's powerful enough to kind of get absolutely crazy with effects. So for instance, again, let's copy and paste this. Let's have a very slow moving synth sound. Let's add a very long decay, blah, blah, blah. Some bit of delay, some reverb, maybe. Let's see. So again, variables, very interesting. How many times you want this note to be played? A lot of times. You could copy this over here, but I feel that this kind of becomes risky because you can have different notes kind of clash with each other. It's actually better just to take things directly from one master scale array, because at least you know every note is being taken from the same array. So we can actually, let's be lazy again. Let's just take this one. Yeah, these two sound good. Now this is just a part where you can become a bit creative. So again, the in array is this one. Trigger a counter. Take that on play. So you can kind of start thinking, okay, how many times do you want this note to change? Do you want like a small arpeggiator? Do you want like very, very long notes? So in our case, since it's a long sound that we're creating, it's actually better for it to not have too many notes. But again, that's really up to you. And then take a random in array, put this in the MIDI in. And then if you press, oh, actually I should plug this in. That would be a better idea. And just to kind of skip ahead, I'm not going to create an input. I know that's not very good, but just to make things a bit easier to follow, let's go here. So what does this sound like? Hopefully not too bad. Not great. So let's reduce the decay time. Actually not too bad. I'm still thinking of that 21 Pilots song for some reason, so hopefully we won't get a copyright strike on this. But yeah, so essentially you can keep building upon this, and I made another preset that I was kind of playing around. So you can get pretty quickly to this kind of thing. And you can kind of recognize what I've been doing with you guys live, is that you can, I started with the kick, the snare, the hi-hat, etc. I'm going to reduce the volume because I think this is just a tiny bit too loud. Yeah, there we go. Just mute these. And so on and so on. So you can get some pretty interesting result that you can actually edit in real time. So all of this can be changed in Engine. So you could have, for instance, a soundtrack to your game, and maybe if your health is low, you can change from the major notes to the minor notes or something like that. You can add distortion, you can add reverb. So there's really no limit. Like, I actually have to limit myself before I go absolutely insane with these things, because again, you can copy paste these, make a second one. Or this demo, for instance, this is called Test Demo 5.1. So let me find it again. Let's say you have an audio guy who's a bit less technical than me, but would like to play around with the meta sound. You can create like a basic meta sound. Let's call this simple. And so the test demo that we've just listened to is actually accessible here. If I write test demo, there you go. And all the inputs, all the distortion, the things you can do are readily available. So maybe someone who has no knowledge, if you name things correctly, of course, can get into it and start playing around and just pressing play, put the output. So yeah, that's pretty much how far you can push things. That's how I did the demo, the last video in the demo, so the synthwave procedural generator. I'm still working on it now, it's been a while, but I feel like you can really push things far. That we'll probably see later on in other talks. But yeah, that's why I was really interested in blending both technologies, because when you have some kind of person like me who's very musical but doesn't have a lot of technical knowledge, I still managed to get into there with like the available resources. So hopefully I didn't scare you off too much with all these nodes, because you can go even worse than this, and hopefully it was understandable. But yeah, otherwise that's cool, because we have 5 minutes for Q&A. So thank you for listening.